For the purpose of communication, my name is Sven. Forget about the last name for the simple reason that despite the excellent pronunciation of my Teutonic last name, this is pretty difficult for everyone. So thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Despite the fact that I only took office 6 weeks ago, I hope I can contribute a bit with some ideas to the debate. I'm looking forward to your questions. I'd like to structure my brief presentation, and I hope I don't fill in the 20 minutes as suggested, along 3 lines, some key messages which summarize the Council conclusions which were adopted by the Council 2 days ago and which will be endorsed in today's European Council in Brussels. Secondly, a bit of a reality check between the 12-point EU Commission Action Plan and the Council conclusions. And lastly, for initiating the debate, also trying to respond to the 4 questions you asked me in terms of leadership by the Commission and the follow-up later on towards the UN high-level plenary meeting in New York. What are the key messages? First of all, the EU, I may say, not just the Commission, the EU believes that the MDGs can still be attained if the necessary political will, the necessary resources, and the necessary international burden sharing on all accounts is mobilized and achieved. If you look at the available evidence so far, you would say that among the 8 MDGs, and I'm talking about MDG 8 now because it's a different topic, the one first on eradicating hunger and poverty, 3 is gender, maternal health, infant mortality, child and infant mortality, and access to sanitation are those which are most affected in terms of being off track, and in terms of region, it's the sub-Saharan Africa region which is most behind. With that kind of background information in mind, we suggest the following, that we focus the next few years our available funds we have EU-wide on those countries which are most lagging behind and where MDGs are most off track. As a result of which, the Council invited the Commission to propose a list of priority countries. We're just doing this as we speak. We agreed with the member states to convene a meeting in a couple of weeks to agree on a methodology. This seems easier than said because there is no statistical, empirically verified base as we speak. We have UN data at UN dashboard data, we have some UNDP certified reports, we have some WHO and FAO reports on food security and global health, but that's the only thing we have to look at this stage. In terms of needs assessment, we basically rely on internationally available evidence by international bodies, but we also want to look at firm commitments. Firm commitments because we think that the ownership aspect is very important. In the Council conclusions, we say that unless countries make firm commitments and integrate or incorporate their MDG targets, international development strategies, we will not really feel or committed to support them. So there are 2 things, a needs assessment and a performance or commitment assessment. And that is something we try to operationalize. So the second aspect I just mentioned then is ownership. We believe that so far the discussion on MDGs has been a bit donor-driven. And we haven't seen much of involvement of the beneficiary, recipient, or target countries themselves. So that is a call for action on their side as well, which I think we need to look at. The third important message is that we look obviously at financing for development from a holistic perspective. If you take a look at the overall financing gaps identified for financing global public goods, climate change financing, development, and especially MDGs, we cannot simply look at the ODA figures. 0.7% is not sufficient if all member states of the EU were to reach that, to bridge that gap. It's impossible. Copenhagen Accord stipulate that by 2020, 100 billion have to be mobilized annually. So we have to find some other solutions in addition to the ODA. So while we underline the importance that national governments and the EU in particular has to reach the 0.7 target, we have to look at other sources. What are the other sources? First of all, and also in the context of promoting and recalling the importance of ownership, we say domestic resource mobilization is key to it. In that context, you may want to take a look at the Council conclusions on tax and development, cooperating with developing countries on promoting good governance. We can come to it later on maybe in the discussion, because this is a separate issue, but a very important one, where we think that apart from mobilizing domestic capacities to better manage their own resources, it's also important that we improve the international tax environment so the developing countries can more effectively benefit and have effective tools to fight illicit financial flows, which, as you know, some NGOs and academia is said to be $1 trillion yearly, so 7, 8, 9 times of official development assistance. So that's an important aspect, domestic resource mobilization. The other important aspect is we recall that official development assistance is the backbone for the time being of providing assistance. Now, the Commission suggested verifiable annual action plans to be monitored in the context of a peer review and to be communicated and reported back to the European Council. That's what the communication says. I come to it later. This has been a bit watered down in the Council conclusions. Another important resource, obviously, is foreign direct investments and domestic investments and anything to mobilize the private sector in providing funds for development as a catalyst through public-private partnerships, but also in trying to make sure that they reach development goals. In this context, one could have mentioned remittances, which we didn't mention in our communication, but that's an important issue as well in order to address poverty-related needs and basic need satisfaction. Last but not least, we're talking about innovative financing for development. It is a subject matter which is assessed quite differently. I come to it later in member states. But we believe that in addition to official development assistance, we need to ensure that stable and predictable financial flows can go towards financing global public goods, notably climate change and MDG-related objectives. And if you read well the Council conclusions, we say complement. It's indicative. We don't say may or should or something. We say it has to be, because there's an ongoing discussion at member state level that in the ODA plus concept that sometimes some member states think it should be part and parcel of their overall official development assistance they provide and report to the OECD DAC every year. This is financing for development. Now comes the fourth message. Policy coherence, or the impact of policies on development MDG. Now that's something which so far hasn't been looked at in sufficient degree of detail and insistence by all development practitioners and stakeholders. The EU, obviously, as you know, in the European consensus, we have identified 12 different policy areas where we think we have to make sure that non-aid policies further development objectives. But policy coherence is far more, if I may make this little sort of annex, is far more complex than that. It's not just that you have policy coherence at EU or donor level between your development objectives and your non-aid policies, agriculture, trade, environment, etc., or migration. It's also that the coherence exists between policies and the means, right? And it's also important that you have coherence at donor level at large. It's not sufficient to have the European Union applying policy coherence if China, Japan, and the US doesn't do it. And it's also not sufficient if there's no coherence between what the recipient countries do and the donor countries do. So it's a very complex matter which hasn't properly studied and analyzed so far. However, there's a call for action in the Council conclusions that indeed we think we need to operationalize further. We issued a staff working document on a PCD work program, 2010-2013, where we proposed 5 topics: climate change, trade and finance, food security, migration, and security. And we will now engage in a consultation mechanism with process with the member states to define in which areas we can identify targets and benchmarks to use them as an operational guidance for EU decision-making in this field. So that's the aspect of policy coherence. And now comes the last aspect, the 6th one, I think, if I count it correctly, aid effectiveness. Aid effectiveness, obviously, we are under the obligations of the Paris-Accra agenda commitments, plus we have Seoul in a couple of 6-7 months' time, not 8 months, I think. So there's an ongoing process with international agreed commitments and targets. The Council invites the Commission to provide further proposals, in particular in terms of joint programming and in division of labor, and your mutual accountability and transparency. And the Commission committed itself to present before the end of this year a communication on accountability and transparency, and by the first semester 2011 on joint programming. In addition to that, we will further agree by the end of this year on a division of labor chapter, which is still missing in our operational aid effectiveness framework, which the Council adopted in November. So this basically is the thrust of the Council conclusions. Let's make a little of a reality check, where we, the Commission, fell short of our expectations because member states had different opinions on that. And I'm not mentioning any specific member states here, but in general. The most obvious shortfall or shortcoming in that Council conclusion would be then obviously the official development assistance chapter, where contrary to what we have proposed in our communication of the 21st of April, we said establish realistic, verifiable annual action plans for reaching individual targets and publish the first plans before September 2010. Now, if you read the Council conclusions, we're able to maintain some adjectives here, but on the noun front, we failed a little bit. So there are no plans anymore, but verifiable and annual actions. And there was no date, obviously. So, but at least we got an agreement at EU level that there is a process, adopted to provide at individual level that member states have to provide some sort of evidence on what they're doing on the official development assistance front. Secondly, we called, for instance, for an annual EU internal ODA peer review and report the results to the European Council. That did not survive Council discussions either. The peer review was taken out, and also the question on whether what we do with the findings annually hasn't been solved. If you read the Council conclusions, the Council will decide on how to deal with that matter. But they underlined the importance of the Monterey report, and that's something which very often people tend to underestimate. While in the para on ODA, no mentioning of the Monterey report as such was made, a very specific mentioning of the Monterey report as a tool for increasing transparency accountability was made in 36 under 8 effectiveness. So if you cross-check both paras, you can assume that while so far the Monterey report was basically an annex as a staff working document, which is not doesn't contain policy recommendations at Commission level, it now can become more of a self-standing communication in which the Commission can make specific recommendations. So through an intelligent interpretation of the Council conclusions, one may as well conclude that part of the agenda can still be, how shall I say, put to good use, what we initially thought. And then a last point which we thought intriguing in our communication was consider enacting national legislation for setting ODA targets. Well, we have a great example, which is Belgium. And the UK was, still is, question mark, I don't know, considering this to do as well. This was part and parcel of our proposal, but for reasons you may understand, this hasn't been accepted. We had an initial compromise position where we said, okay, not your ODA targets, but how about ODA legislation in general, which is fine, because I mean you can have legislation on your official development assistance without specifying your specific benchmarks you want to reach. But also that wasn't possible. So that was something you can see here, and that doesn't come as a surprise. If you are realistic about the impact of the financial crisis in the Eurozone and beyond, and know the little marge de maneuver member states have, and obviously the list of priorities they have to ensure that we all have our pensions still being paid out next year, development obviously is not the first of the concerns at that time. Altruism normally, maybe often starts at home. So that is an issue which we have to take into consideration. This doesn't mean we, in the Commission or we in the EU in general, should undermine the importance of sticking to our pledges and commitments, but that explains why certain member states feel a bit fragile when we talk about very strong, verifiable action plans which can be monitored by the civil society and by everybody else. And some even say, listen, isn't it counterproductive if you go out in the public and say you want to do this by this year, and then you reach it, and then you basically get criticism from the G77 on the NGOs and all kinds of people who are stakeholders. So they say it might even be counterproductive to our efforts, and it might take away the leeway we need, the flexibility to address over a period of time, 2015, the time we need to basically commit or respect our commitments. So this argument was made also very important. I read in some statements of NGOs on the Council conclusion in the statement that they felt a little bit underwhelmed by our commitments on the 80 factors agenda, but I think the Council conclusions more or less are in line with what we said in our communication. And also I think that the fact that the Council invites the Commission now to propose at a given date further proposals to render this more effective, and in the lead up to Seoul, I think this is a good sign. And I tell you also that the fact it wasn't easy to get all member states agreeing on a synchronization or harmonization, as some called it, of programming cycles. It's an old story, right? We need to harmonize, synchronize programming of the European development cooperation with the member states and on the basis of the national programming cycles in the developing countries. So we start in developing countries, and we try to get our EU act together in the context of local donor cooperation. That seems easy to you, but it's not so those who don't know the reality on the terrain. Very often it's very difficult. Some member states don't have multi-annual commitments, so they work on annual basis, and it's very difficult to get this together. So it was positive that the Council basically endorsed that. I think, because I have a little time, I'd like to highlight, however, one thing. If you read or compare the tax governance communication of the Commission and see the Council conclusions, you see that the Council conclusions are in some ways more forward-looking and more ambitious than even the text of the communication. And this, I just want to address those of you who know a little bit about the tax governance issue, especially in the point where was made about tax information, where a global system for exchange information was basically proposed through multilateral instruments. It was something, and very important, to look at the possibility of targeting beneficial ownership of all legal structures, something we haven't mentioned in our communication, but some member states wanted to have it there. And that's a breakthrough. Of those of you who follow up on the international discussion on tax governance, the breakthrough for the EU to make such a statement at a political level. One may criticize the lack of ambition in other parts, but I think also the fact that we mentioned country-by-country reporting, fighting what we call unfair transfer pricing practices, calling for using the OECD and the UN models, and ensuring that beneficiary countries and member states support developing countries to enhance their capacities to be able to actually monitor tax compliance of multinationals. All these are very positive things, which so far never ever the EU has said, and I'm pretty confident this is a very important step in the right direction. So to sum up, your 4 questions: does it mark strategic leadership, the communication? To an extent. Does it suggest that the Commissioner, Mr. Peebles, will take political risks? Yeah. Question mark. I'm a little bit, I'm not sure. I'm political risk. I mean, he certainly takes a very clear stance on reaching the MDG targets and living up to the challenge. Political risk is a difficult assessment for me to make. Will it excite and challenge member states? It did, I tell you. I was in the CODEF nights and days, and it did excite everybody and challenge them quite a bit. And will it enable the EU to lead the way at the UN MG Summit in September? A bit. And I say this with confidence because as we speak, we have 3 parallel processes in the lead up to New York. While the outcome negotiations on the UN summit are in full swing right now, and we have provided our input. And the problem right now is getting the EU position more or less agreed with the G77. We have, in a week's time, a joint declaration of the ACP EU in Ouagadougou at the Joint Ministerial Council, which is basically a reflection of the main thrust and gist of the Council conclusions. That's positive. We have 78 countries in line in terms of declarations with our position. Then we have the EU and African Union declaration. As you may know, there is a EU-AU summit in Tripoli at the end of November. And we want to make, at the New York level event, also a joint declaration with the African Union. And we work together, by the way, with a co-chair, which is the UK, on an acceptable compromise with the African Union. And last, and maybe also least, in this case, we're working with the US right now on a joint declaration on the MDGs, but it's not quite sure. This is just for internal consumption. We are not sure whether we reach that or whether it's even a useful instrument to consider at this stage. Let me finish with that, and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.